By way of introduction, we have something called the Erev Tafshilin, we have something called the Erev Chatzeris. Erev Tafshilin is, of course, when Yom Tov falls out on Erev Shabbos. In order to be able to prepare to cook on Friday, on Yom Tov, for Shabbos, we need to make an Erev Tafshilin. This is done by taking some challah, some bread, as well as a cooked dish, and we make this Erev. Technically, this Erev could be eaten right after we finished our preparations, but as we'll see in the Sicha, there's an inyan in leaving it also for Shabbos itself, using it on Shabbos. There's also something called an Erev Chatzeros. This is when you have a few people that are all within a private domain, but separate apartments, for example, or houses and things like that. They will have a shared courtyard, etc., and they want to be able to carry. They make an Erev Chatzeros, again being done with food. This Erev Chatzeros needs to exist at least till Shabbos comes in, and again we'll see what we could do with it on Shabbos itself. The Rebbe starts over the Sicha by saying that by Erev Tafshilin the din is that as soon as we finish making all of our preparations for Shabbos, so we can now technically go ahead and eat the Erev on the day of Yom Tov, that is Friday, Erev Shabbos. However, in the Ma'aril it says, he had instituted a custom to use the bread of the Erev Tafshilin for Lechem Mishnah, using it on Friday night, using it again Shabbos morning, and finally on Shalosh Shudas, actually breaking the bread and using it, eating it. So too the Marshal brings the same idea that since the Erev needs to be Kayam, needs to exist, it's not fitting to eat it until Leil Shabbos, until Friday night. Nevertheless, the minig of the Maharam was, the Marshal brings, to use the kikar as part of the Lechem Mishnah, to use this loaf of part of the Lechem Mishnah. Again, the same idea. Leil Shabbos, which is Friday night, again the next morning, and finally at the third meal to break it and to use it. Because a mitzvah was done with it once, it is fitting to do more mitzvahs with it. The Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch brings this minig as well. And this is what the Alter Rebbe says. Lechatchila, the bread and the cooked dish need to be in existence until after you finish preparing everything for Shabbos. Nevertheless, mitzvah min hamuvcha, the best way of performing the mitzvah is to wait with eating the bread of the Erev Tafshilin until one of the meals of Shabbos in order to break and eat the bread. Because anything you did one mitzvah with it, it is fitting to do another mitzvah with it. Says the Alter Rebbe, and some have the custom not to break the bread all the way until the third meal of Shabbos in order to do many mitzvahs with it. And he brings the same idea that they use it as part of Lechem Mishnah for Friday night in the first meal, part of the Lechem Mishnah in the second meal of Shabbos, and finally breaking it in the third meal of Shabbos. Now the source of this concept, that since we did a mitzvah with it once, Erev Tavshilin, so we should do another mitzvah with it, Lechem Mishnah Sudas Shabbos, is actually in the Gemara in regards to Erev Chatzeros, where it says that of Ami and of Asi, when it happened that the Erev Chatzeros was in their house, in other words, the Erev Chatzeros could be left in any of the apartments or houses that are joining this Erev. It would be placed in different houses at times. So if it was in Rav Ami or Rav Asi's house, so then this Erev that would have been made before Shabbos, so now on Shabbos they would use it to make Hamoitzi Lechem in Haaretz. They said, because one mitzvah was done with it, let's do another mitzvah with it. So now, what happens as far as our minig in regards to Erev Chatzeros? So again, the Maharil brings that on Leil Shabbos, on Friday night, and Shachris, he uses it for Lechem Mishnah, as part of Lechem Mishnah. Technically, on Friday night, you could eat it already. But it was specifically precious to him. He wants to do another mitzvah with it. And finally, in Su'udah Shlishis, he would break that bread that he used, that he made Erev Chatzeros. Similar way in the Marshal brings the same idea that the minig is again by Erev Chatzeros, that we eat this bread only by Su'udah Shlishis, after you've used it for Lechem Mishnah, by the first two meals, exactly the same as by Erev Tavshilin. Now let's look at the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe brings, in regards to Erev Chatzeros, he only brings the halacha from the Ramah, he's quoting, that we have Lipskier of Beshabbos Shachris to use to break the bread Shabbos morning, since one mitzvah was done with it, the mitzvah of Erev Chatzeros that is. So it's good to do another mitzvah with it, but he does not bring the mitzvah of breaking it only at Su'udah Shlishis in order to do even more mitzvahs with it. So we need to understand, since the Maharil and the Marshal mention this minig, both by Erev Tavshilin and Erev Chatzeros, to use it by the third meal, why is it that the Alter Rebbe brings the minig only by Erev Tavshilin and not by Erev Chatzeros, especially as we quoted before, that the whole idea where we get this from, that since you did a mitzvah with it, let's do another mitzvah with it, actually in the Gemara originates by Erev Chatzeros. In order to understand this, says the Rebbe, we first need to deal with a difficulty with the actual minhag itself of breaking the Erev Tavshilin by the third meal of Shabbos in order to do many mitzvahs with it. And the question is, the first two Sudas Shabbos actually have a greater chashivus as far as the meal and food is concerned than the third meal. That is, because according to some opinions, you don't even need lechem mishnah by the third meal at all. Furthermore, there are opinions that say you don't even have bread. You don't even need to have bread by the third meal. You can even just have one of the 5 grains, which is in other words mezainis. Furthermore, there are some opinions that say you can be yoitza with fruit. So the question then is, why should we delay in breaking the bread of the Erev all the way to Seudah Shlishis when eating bread specifically is not even so chashav, perhaps it is even completely optional? Seemingly it would be more appropriate, if we want to use it for a mitzvah, it would be more appropriate to break the bread in the morning meal, which then what you're doing with the Erev is not only twice the mitzvah of lechem mishnah, but also when you eat the Erev itself now is part of the mitzvah and the obligation of Seudah Shabbos. A Seudah that everyone agrees you need to eat bread, again, as opposed to if you would be eating it by Seudah Shlishis, then the eating itself is not even necessarily a mitzvah. Says the Rebbe, we cannot say that it's because you're going to have, with doing a third mitzvah with this loaf of bread, the bracha of hamoitzi, by the Seudah Shlishis, because if there's no chiyuv by Seudah Shlishis, according to some opinions, to have bread, then the bracha of hamoitzi is only what's called the birchas hanenin. It's not part of the mitzvah. It's only birchas hanenin. And that birchas hanenin, that hamoitzi you would have had if you broke it by shachris, by the Seudah of the morning, saying hamoitzi and breaking it and eating it. In addition to, of course, the mitzvah of lechem mishnah. So again, we need to understand what's the significance of leaving it specifically for Seudah Shlishis. To explain this, the Rebbe now goes into the whole idea of Erev Tavshilin and what's the reason for it. So the Rebbe says, in the Gemara we have 2 reasons for the takana, for this institution of Erev Tavshilin. Rava says the point of Erev Tavshilin is in order to make sure that we're going to choose a nice good portion for Shabbos and a good portion for Yom Tov as far as food is concerned. What does this mean? Rashi explains that because you're making the Erev, so that's going to make sure that you're remembering Shabbos and you're not going to finish all the food on Yom Tov. In other words, according to this, the takana of Erev Tavshilin is to increase, to add in the covet of Shabbos. It's all about Shabbos, to make sure you have food for Shabbos. Then comes Rav Ashi and says that the point of the Erev Tavshilin is we actually want to make sure that you're not going to end up cooking or baking on Yom Tov for the middle of the week. So when you make the Erev Tavshilin, what it's going to remind you and tell you is, if I can't even bake from Yom Tov to Shabbos, then how much more so I can't bake from Yom Tov for the middle of the week? In other words, according to this, it's more about adding in the covet of Yom Tov. What's the practical difference between these 2 reasons? So the Rosh says, if the reason is according to Rava, so we should have a good portion for Shabbos, then when does this Erev need to be made? It has to be made as close as possible to the time we're going to use it on Erev Yom Tov. This is the day when we're preparing the food for Yom Tov. And when we make this Erev, it's going to remind us, let's make some food for Shabbos. Let's remember we have to make food for Shabbos. If we're going to make this food way in advance in a previous day, that's not going to help me to make sure that I'm preparing and having the needs and the food for Shabbos when I need to prepare it on that day of Erev Yom Tov. However, according to the opinion of Rav Ashi, if the reason is that it's about knowing that we don't bake on Yom Tov for the middle of the week, and that's why I'm going to make an Erev to allow me even to bake for Shabbos. So then it's enough, as long as this Erev is around on Erev Yom Tov, then that's enough. I have this simon, it reminds me. But actually making the Erev itself technically can be made way in advance before Erev Yom Tov. Now, the Alter Rebbe brings both reasons in Shulchan Aruch. In other words, both reasons of the Gemara, but the Alter Rebbe actually says it in an opposite order, as we'll see later in the Sicha also how the Rebbe explains that. But the Alter Rebbe says, first of all, it's in order to add B'kavod Yom Tov, as we explained, because that's going to remind you that you're not allowed to cook on Yom Tov for the middle of the week. And number 2, it's to add for the kavod of Shabbos, as we explained, because to make sure you have food for Shabbos, etc. The Alter Rebbe also brings this nafkamina that we just said, this difference lahalacha. In other words, when you have to make the Erev. Practically, what do we do? Says the Alter Rebbe, Inyan Maisa. Practically, the Erev needs to be made on Erev Yom Tov Mamish. And you only make it for this Yom Tov. And that goes according to this second reason in the Alter Rebbe's order, the second reason, because we're taking also this opinion into consideration that it's being done for the honor of Shabbos. But b'di'evet, says the Alter Rebbe, if you made the Erev many days before Yom Tov, and on Erev Yom Tov you actually forgot about it, you didn't make an Erev, then you could rely on that Erev you made in advance. In other words, lechatchila, the minig is to take into consideration also this reason that we're choosing to make sure we have a good portion for Shabbos as well. Says the Rebbe, the difference between these two reasons in the Gemara is not only whether the main takana is for the sake of Yom Tov, or is it mainly for the sake of Shabbos, but the Rebbe says furthermore, if we actually look at the content of how the takana works, and the mechanism of what the takana is all about, according to Rav Ashi, which again Rav Ashi is the one that says it's about making sure we're not going to end up baking on Yom Tov for the middle of the week, then the whole point of this institution, of this takana, is all a negative. And in two details, two aspects. Number one, it's to make sure, in other words, that there's no isur comes about, that we shouldn't be nichshal chas v'shalom, we shouldn't stumble in cooking from Yom Tov for the middle of the week. That's number one. And number two, what is this takana actually dealing with now? So it's telling us if that's the case, we can't even cook from Yom Tov to Shabbos. So it's all about a negative. It's about making sure we don't do an avera of cooking from Yom Tov in the middle of the week. And what is the takana? That you're not allowed to cook from Yom Tov for Shabbos unless we make this Erev, we start already making some dish on Erev Yom Tov. However, according to Rava, the Rebbe says it's all positive. The whole takana is more of a positive, and again in both details. Number one, as a result of this takana of Erev Tavshilin, we're making sure that the hachana for Shabbos should be proper. In other words, we're going to be choosing nice, good food for Shabbos, making sure we have food for Shabbos. And therefore, what's the point? Number two, what's the point of the Erev? What's the point of the takana? The point of the takana is not like we said before, it's about the not cooking on Yom Tov for Shabbos. It's more the other way around. The point of the takana is making the Erev. That is the point, to remind us the obligation to prepare for Shabbos. In other words, the whole idea of not cooking on Yom Tov for Shabbos, unless we make the Erev, is about strengthening the takana of preparing for Shabbos properly. Again, in the first way, the way we looked at it, it's all about an isur. It's all about the point is the not cooking. Not cooking for middle of the week, it's not cooking for Shabbos, unless we do something about it. The way we look at it now, it's the other way around. It's all about ensuring that we're going to be preparing for Shabbos, and that's why we shouldn't cook on Yom Tov for Shabbos unless we made Erev. Again, this is all about a reminder to make sure that in advance we're going to have plenty of food for Shabbos. Says the Rebbe, based on this, we're going to understand another concept. In the Gemara brings two asmachtos, two psukim that we could sort of also use as a sort of support for the idea of Erev Tavshilin. So Erev Tavshilin is clearly a takana midrabanan, but the Gemara finds a certain support in psukim. Amar Shmuel says, the pasuk says, Zocher es yom ha-Shabbos l'katshei. Remember the day of Shabbos to make it holy. What does this mean, says Shmuel? Zachareyu, remember it. Me'acher shebol hashkichai. Make sure you remember it from someone that is coming to try to make you forget about it. In other words, there is a threat. There's someone that might make you forget about it. As we'll soon see, it means that when Yom Tov is around, it might make you forget about Shabbos. So the point of Zocher es yom ha-Shabbos is telling you, remember Shabbos. Then the Gemara says, V'tana, there's a Tana that brings it from the following pasuk. This is a pasuk that says, actually in this parsha, in Parsha Beshalach, regarding the mon, the pasuk says, Eis asher toifu eifu, ve'eis asher tavashlu bashelu, you should, that which you should bake, that which you should cook, you will cook. What does this mean? Amar Rabbi Eliezer learns from here that if you want to cook on Yom Tov or bake on Yom Tov, Eis asher toifu eifu means that you should bake on something that you've baked already. In other words, if you want to bake now for Shabbos, you should have baked already something before. That's the Erev Tavshilin. And this is what the Chachamim supported, the idea of Erev Tavshilin min ha-Torah. Now, going back to the first opinion, Zachareyu me'acher shebol hashkichai, Rashi explains that when Yom Tov falls out on Erev Shabbos, So it's very likely, it's very possible that Shabbos should be forgotten because of Yom Tov. Person is having so much Su'udas Hayoim, so much Su'udah of Yom Tov, he's not going to leave over anything for Shabbos, according to the proper honor of Shabbos. So the Pasuk is warning you to remember Shabbos, Zocher es Yom HaShabbos. So when you make this Erev Tavshilin, that itself is making sure that you remember it. From Rashi we understand that this asmachta of this pasuk, Zocher es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadshay, remember it from the one who's going to try to make you forget it, is going to go only according to the reason of Rava, which again, Rava is the one that said that it's about preparing food for Shabbos. And the Rebbe says what's not understood is the Gemara brings both reasons, in other words, this argument between Rava and Rav Ashi, immediately following this pasuk, this asmachta of Zocher es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadshay. The other pasuk that we brought from the Mon, the Gemara is going to bring only later, after already discussing both opinions of Rava and Rav Ashi. So why is Rashi saying it? In other words, such an obvious thing it seems to Rashi, that the asmachta of this pasuk, Zocher es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadshay, is only according to Rava. As the Rebbe points out in the footnotes, that there's other Mefarshim that say that this pasuk could work according to both opinions. But the Rebbe says, now we can understand. The second asmachta, the one of Ein oifen ela ala ofu, you only bake it, you have something you baked before, is more expressing that the takana has to do with a negative. In other words, that you're not allowed to cook on Yom Tov, ein oifen, you're not allowed to cook unless you have cooked something already before Shabbos. So in other words, before Yom Tov, that is. Right, the Erev Tavshilin, which would be on the Thursday before the Friday. Whereas the limud, when we learn out from Zocher es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadshay, as we explained, it's more about a positive. It's all about remembering Shabbos. That's the point of the Erev. And this is why Rashi says that this asmachta of Zocher es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadshay fits with the Rava's reason that the whole point of Erev Tavshilin is all about a positive. It's all about remembering Shabbos, meaning you're going to choose a nice, good portion, making sure you have good food for Shabbos. Says the Rebbe, based on everything we explained, that according to Rava, the whole point of the Erev Tavshilin is all a positive. It's all about remembering Shabbos. Make sure that Shabbos is remembered. And specifically in a case when there's a threat that something else or someone else might make you forget it. Says the Rebbe, if that's the case, we could say that it makes sense, according to this reason, there's room for keeping the Erev Tavshilin also for Shabbos itself. In other words, not eating it up right after you finish your preparations. That is, even though it's true that once you finish preparing for Shabbos and you took care of this concern that Shabbos might be forgotten and you won't leave food for Shabbos according to the honor of Shabbos, and you're making sure that you're not going to finish everything on Yom Tov, and therefore, I said, technically you could eat the Erev, but nevertheless, if the Erev is all about a positive thing, helping you remember Shabbos, Zocher es Yom HaShabbos, it makes sense that this memory coming from the Erev should also continue in Shabbos itself. As a simple understanding of the word Zocher es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadshay, that you remember Shabbos on Shabbos itself, so that it makes a lot of sense to say, let's keep the Erev on Shabbos too. Or to put it in slightly a different way, the Rebbe says, since we're dealing specifically on a Shabbos that's likely to be forgotten because it's following Yom Tov, so perhaps the Zocher es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadshay, to have something to remind you about this Shabbos, on this Shabbos should be even more emphasized than a regular Shabbos. And therefore that's going to be also through this Erev Tavshilin, having this Erev Tavshilin on Shabbos itself. Says the Rebbe, we can now say that this is the reason why it says in the Maharil regarding Erev Tavshilin, V'toiv lahoiser mi Yom Tov l'Shabbos, that it's good to leave over from the Erev Tavshilin from Yom Tov to Shabbos, to keep the Erev for Shabbos, which if we have the simple reading of this expression, it sounds like that it's not only because of the reason that since a mitzvah was done with it, well, let's do another mitzvah with it. It says it's good to leave over from Yom Tov to Shabbos. So this is as explained, and we're going to explain more in a minute. It's so bad because we want to keep the Erev for Shabbos as well because of this Zocher. It's even more understood. We could see this in what says in the Minhagim of the Marat Tirna. It says V'yishmoir ha'eruv ad sheyikones haShabbos. Keep the Erev until Shabbos comes. Because if we go according to Rava, that it's all because of Kavod Shabbos and the positive idea of Zocher, then keeping the Erev on Shabbos, this is an additional aspect in the Zochereu of the Erev Tavshilin. The Erev Tavshilin keeping or reminding us more about Shabbos. Says the Rebbe, now we can also look carefully at the words, the precise words of the Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch. And the Rebbe says like this. We'll look at the difference now by the Erev Chatzeris and the Erev Tavshilin. By Erev Chatzeris it says, the Erev Ein Tzarech Liyiskayim only needs to exist during the time of Bein Hashmoshes. That is, during the time when Shabbos is coming in. Just after Shkia, etc. Then the Alter Rebbe says, V'yesh levtzoya olav b'Shabbos shachris, and V'yesh, how would we translate the V'yesh? It's a good idea, it's a good thing to this is the way it should be done, to break at Shabbos morning. Since one mitzvah was done with it, then it's good to do another mitzvah with it. From the flow of the Alter Rebbe's Lashon, it's understood that the hidur of breaking at Shabbos morning has nothing to do with the geder of Erev Chatzeris. The Erev Chatzeris needs to stay until Shabbos. But there's a side point over here that with this we're going to do another mitzvah. Since you did already one mitzvah with it, let's do another mitzvah. But now let's look at the wording of the Alter Rebbe in Erev Tavshilin. There the Alter Rebbe is medayik. It says lechatchila, the bread and the tavshil, the food, the cooked food, need to remain until you finish the preparations for Shabbos, and then you can eat it. Me'ikar adin. In other words, in the basic level of the halacha, now you can eat it. Then the Alter Rebbe says, umikol mokai mitzvah min hamuvchar. By the way to perform the mitzvah the best way is to wait with eating the bread of the Erev Tavshilin until one of the sudas of Shabbos in order to break it and use it, etc. Because everything you did one mitzvah with it, it's a good idea to do another mitzvah. So if we look over here at the precise words of the Alter Rebbe and the way the words are flowing from each other, it's understood that this idea that you should wait with eating the bread until one of the sudas of Shabbos is not just a side point, in other words, because we did one mitzvah. But it's, as the Alter Rebbe says, mitzvah min hamuvchar, it sounds like it's the best way of performing this mitzvah of Erev Tavshilin itself. It's best to keep it for one of the sudas of Shabbos. Why is that? Based on what we explained in Rava's reason, it's understood. Because when we use the Erev practically for one of the needs and sudas of Shabbos, we're fulfilling that Zachrei, remembering Shabbos in the mitzvah min hamuvchar. The point of Erev Tavshilin is to remind us of Shabbos, to help us remember Shabbos. You're doing that mitzvah in the best way. And that's why the Alter Rebbe says that Mikol Mokei mitzvah min hamuvchar, to wait. Because he's paskening that lechatchila, we should be noyeg according to the second reason, which is lahar b'zmukvay Shabbos, as we said already before. And this was in the context when we were speaking about when you need to make the Erev. We saw that the Alter Rebbe is concerned, or we should take into concern at least this opinion that we're also doing it for Shabbos, for the kavod of Shabbos, which is the opinion of Rava. Says the Rebbe, now we could also understand why the Alter Rebbe brings this minhag of breaking the bread of the Erev by Suda Shlishis only by Erev Tavshilin and not by Erev Chatzeris. Because if, as we explained before, that the Erev Tavshilin is to add in the kavod of Shabbos, and that is by doing it, by using the Erev Tavshilin for the needs of Shabbos, that's part of the Zachreu of Shabbos. So what follows then is that the more you use it, and the longer you have the Erev and use it for the Suda Shabbos, you have it by the first two meals for Lechem Mishnah, and by the third one finally you're breaking it and eating it, then more and more are you having this advantage of Zachreu, of remembering Shabbos. In other words, every time you're eating the food of Shabbos, which are prepared, you prepared on Yom Tov through the Erev, you're adding more and more in this idea of the Zachreu, that the idea of the Erev is to remind you about Shabbos, by bringing it, making it part of your meal, having the Erev Tavshilin as part of that meal as well. In other words, when you have that Erev by each and every meal, even by the last meal, by the Suda Shlishis, then you're connecting that idea of that the Erev Tavshilin is supposed to be reminding you about Shabbos with every aspect of Shabbos, all the way till the very last needs of Shabbos, including the last meal. Says the Rebbe, but this is only true by Erev Tavshilin, because Erev Tavshilin has the idea that, according to one opinion, the whole point of the Erev Tavshilin is the Zachreu, is about reminding you of Shabbos. And therefore it makes sense to keep it as long as possible all the way to Suda Shlishis. Whereas Erev Chatzeris, which doesn't have this reason and this geder at all, that's not what an Erev Chatzeris is about. So then according to the Alter Rebbe, there's no svara to leave the Erev for Suda Shlishis. And if there's no reason to leave it for Suda Shlishis, then as we said, on the contrary, it's better to use it by Shacharis, because then you're fulfilling a mitzvah of eating Suda Shabbos with this bread, which definitely must have bread. As we said, everyone agrees to that. The Rebbe now moves on to the Hairah of all of the above mentioned in Avodas Hashem. The Rebbe says the difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov is explained in the Zohar. Shabbos is called Kodesh. Yom Tov is called Mikroi Kodesh. What does that mean? It's called Mikroi Kodesh. The word Mikra is like from the word Koiri, calling. Yom Tov, we are calling, we are sort of inviting this level of Kodesh. We're bringing that level of Kodesh into an area, into a time that on itself is a weekday, and now we're bringing down the Kedusha into that weekday. Whereas Shabbos is pure Kedusha by itself. In other words, the time of Yom Tov on its own is more connected to Inyan Yichayil, to the mundane things. Right? Yom Tov could fall out on any day of the week, and that day is going to be turned into Yom Tov based on what the Sanhedrin told us, Rosh Chodesh, etc. The avoid of Moya de Hashem Asher Tikru Oisam, that you, the Yidden, Atem, we read it as Atem, the Yidden are the ones that are making Yom Tov, is about, so to speak, inviting or bringing down this level of Kedusha that the eating and the things that we do on Yom Tov should be in a way of Kodesh. Chassidus brings regarding this a pasuk that says, Tzadik Oichel L'Soiva Nafshoy. When a tzaddik eats, he's satisfied with whatever he has. And therefore the Rebbe says, Shabbos, that's Mikadsha V'Kaima, Shabbos that's just holy by itself, it's not about Beistin and Yidden making it holy. Shabbos on its own is Kulei Kodesh. So Chassidus tells us about this day, there is no psoilas, there's no waste at all. It's not about the time of birurim, of needing to elevate anything. Whereas Yom Tov, if a Yid is lacking somewhere in his avodah, even as an individual, so let's say everyone based in did everything properly, b'shleimus in inviting the Yom Tov and making the Yom Tov. But if a person doesn't eat correctly on Yom Tov, then there's, as the pasuk says, and it's explained in the Zohar and Chassidus, there's a pasuk that says, Peresh Chageichem. Hashem is disappointed, or he's going to throw in your faces the dung or the waste of your Yomim Tovim, of your karbonos. And the Zohar says that only says it about Yom Tov, doesn't say it about Shabbos. In other words, because Yom Tov is a day that there could be something negative associated with it, waste, because the person himself has to be bringing the Kedusha into the mundane things, whereas Shabbos is a time that there is at all no waste at all, and therefore, again, quoting that pasuk, there's only tzaddik oichel l'soiv nafshe, there's only the avodah of Kedusha itself. The Rebbe says this is similar to the difference of, we know that there is, when you need to correct and fix the bad, the Alter Rebbe says, when you take something sharp, something sour, and you spiced up well and fixing it well, that it can be eaten. So that's one sort of way of birurim, or fixing the world. And then there's another situation where there's no bad at all. And this is, as the Alter Rebbe refers to in Tanya, as delicacies, things that are just sweet and pleasant as they are. So this is the difference between Yom Tov and Shabbos. Yom Tov is a time when there is birurim, we need to elevate, we're trying to bring Kedusha into a mundane place, and Shabbos is just holy by itself. Says the Rebbe, so this is now going to be the difference between the two reasons for Erev Tavshilin. Is it about for the sake of Yom Tov or Shabbos? According to the opinion that says it's for the sake of Kavod Yom Tov, and as we said before, it's more going to be more about dealing with the negative, as we said before. Whereas if it's about Shabbos, we said it's all about the positive. How does this work now according to Chassidus? Since the whole avodah of Yom Tov is about elevating, selecting, fixing the mundane, the weekday things, so therefore the takana, when we say it's about laharbez b'chavod Yom Tov, is a similar sort of idea. What's the takana? It's all about making sure that we're not doing the wrong thing. It's to do with the negative. It's to make sure we're not going to cook on Yom Tov for the middle of the week, etc. Whereas if it's all about the kavod of Shabbos, we said that the whole point of the takana is more of a positive one. Since Shabbos is on its own, Mikadsha V'Kaim, it's a day that's holy on its own, completely higher than the weekday things, than the mundane, on its own, then there is nothing to negate. Everything is fine, beautiful, and holy on Shabbos. Unless, of course, of Chas V'Sholem Rachmana Litzlan, a person on his own brings in some sort of desecration to Shabbos, Chilul Shabbos, Chilul also from the word Choil. In other words, Shabbos is holy. Chas V'Sholem, a person could bring negativity in it. But Shabbos itself is only Kedusha, and therefore the point of the Takana, if we're speaking about L'Kavod Shabbos, that it's all about adding light, achieving something more, achieving in the positive. Says the Rebbe, based on this, we can now explain the reason why the Alter Rebbe brings the two reasons in the opposite order of how they are in the Gemara. We said the Alter Rebbe first brings the reason of Lahar Beis B'Kavod Yom Tiv, and then he brings the reason Lahar Beis B'Kavod Shabbos. Says the Rebbe because this is the order in Avodah. The beginning of Avodah, that's what the Alter Rebbe brings it first. We first start with Sur Meirah, dealing with the negative, including, in time, this would be the idea of, as we said, what's Yom Tov all about? We're taking a weekday day and we turned it into a Yom Tov. It's all about Lahar Beis B'Kavod Yom Tov, so it's more about dealing with the negative. Only then could we start dealing with higher forms of avoid, and that's what Alter Rebbe brings us as second reason, Lahar Beis B'Kavod Shabbos, which again, Shabbos is a day that's holy on its own. It's a day about Asay Toiv. Says the Rebbe, this will now also explain to us regarding when we said before about when you need to make the Erev. We said that lechatchila you should make it mamash on Erev Yom Tov, but otherwise, even if you made it in advance, it's fine. So the Rebbe says now we can understand that as well. And the Rebbe says, what's demanded of every Yid? In other words, what's the absolute, the base level, the absolute thing that's necessary in every time, in every place, in every single area? Sur Meirah is definitely something that's needed. This is an avodah that's needed by every single person. Where is the avodah of negating the whole concept of Ra, that there shouldn't be any evil at all, not only in regards to machshava, dibur, u'mais, and thought, speech, and action and practice, but not having any Ra at all, that's something that not necessarily every single person can accomplish. And therefore, this idea is not going to be li'ikuva. Again, to clarify, we said that Erev Yom, to make it on Erev Yom Tov Mamish, that would be, according to the opinion, that it's l'kavod Shabbos. If it's the opinion that's l'kavod Yom Tov, you would be able to make it in advance. And now what the Rebbe is explaining is that the Rebbe said l'chatchila it's better to do it on Erev Yom Tov. But if not, it's fine if you did it before. But before, you definitely have to do it at least before. You can't not have it at all. So that's what the Rebbe is explaining now. If the idea is getting rid of the Ra, that's definitely necessary. Better if you could even do it. In this case, it would mean doing it right before Yom Tov, which means you're doing it l'kavod Shabbos, which would mean doing it mitzad the positive. The idea of getting rid of Ra completely. There is no Ra, there's only holiness. The Rebbe says this is similar to the difference between a tzaddik and a beinoni. Every Yid could be a beinoni. A tzaddik is already another darga. Or the Rebbe says this is similar to the difference between a skafia and a hapcha. Nevertheless, says the Rebbe, but lechatchila, we should act according to the second reason, which means, again, practically, making the Erev just before Yom Tov, which would be the avodah of Shabbos. Why is that, says the Rebbe? This is similar, says the Rebbe, it's explained in a number of places, that in order for our iskafia to be proper and real, we also have to have the avodah of ishapcha, at least sometimes. This is also similar to something that's explained in Kuntus Eitz HaChaim, in regards to Yechuda Ilah and Yechuda Tata. Just very, very briefly, Yechuda Ilah is that there's absolutely nothing besides Hashem at all. That's that perspective, and Yechuda Tata is the way it's perceived from our world, where there's a world that's one with Hashem and bottled to Hashem, etc. So the Rebbe says, as a result of Yechuda Ilah, usually that causes ishapcha, that there's no bad at all, the bad was completely transformed. Yechuda Tata, that's an attitude of iskafia, bending the bad, pushing away the bad, etc. But it's explained in Kuntus Eitz HaChaim that if you want your Yechuda Tata to be proper, then you also have to have the avodah of Yechuda Ilah, even by those that can't have it in an absolute real way, in a constant way. Now, says the Rebbe, there's another point that's added. Not only the lechatchila should you act in best practice, you should act lefi oifen habeis according to the second tam, which is l'kavod Shabbos, meaning make the Erev on Erev Yom Tov, which would mean to take this higher form of avoid into consideration. But really, what we should do, at least as of a yesh noyagin, but it's brought in Shulchan Aruch, use the Erev Tavshilin by the Seudah Shlishis. Now here we have two extremes, says the Rebbe. When are we preparing the Erev? That's on Erev Yom Tov. That means it represents you're in the very beginning of the Avodah, even before the Avodah of Yom Tov. But on the other hand, every single Yid has the koyach. Already in the beginning, as he's preparing for this Avodah, he could be preparing for not only for the general idea of Shabbos, level of Shabbos, but even for the Seudah Shlishis, which, as we know, is considered the highest level within Shabbos itself. Says the Rebbe, because even as a Yid is holding in the beginning of Avodah, but by the fact that he's thinking and doing an action that's connected to Shabbos, and all the way doing something connected to the Seudah Shlishis, then that itself will affect that his avodah, but that which he is holding by, should be able to be done with an emes and properly, and then bring him to doing even greater avodas.